"You're coming with me," the rancher said, and the world stopped turning. He said it to the giant widow, the one they called a beast, right after the town of Dry Willow tore the clothes from her back and left her naked in the dust. They'd branded her a killer because she was bigger than the man she'd buried, and in their small minds, that was a crime. But then one man, a ghost scarred by a war and a loss that had hollowed him out, stepped through the hate. 4 words. That's all it took to change the course of 2 broken lives. "You're coming with me." Her arms were crossed over her chest, a useless shield. Her knees trembled, a silent betrayal from a body that had never failed her before, but she didn't fall. Her face was a mask carved from stone. No tears. Not a single sound escaped her lips. The good people of Dry Willow had dragged her into the town square, their hands like claws, their voices like rocks. They said she'd killed her husband Silas with her bare hands. They said no woman should be built like a fortress and expect to be treated like a flower. They said she was a monster, so they punished the monster. They spat on her skin, their venom painting her with their own ugliness. They called her every vile name they could conjure from the dark parts of their souls. And when no one stopped them, not the sheriff with his tin star and empty eyes, not the preacher with his Bible and silent tongue, they ripped the simple dress from her body. They left her standing in the red dirt, her only coverings the bruises blooming on her skin and a silence so deep it screamed. They left her there until Abel Ward stepped out of the crowd. He didn't wear a badge, he didn't carry a rifle, he didn't raise his voice against the mob, he just walked. He walked straight through the circle of hate, right up to the woman they had tried to erase from the world. He took off his own dusty coat, the one that smelled of horse and dry earth, and draped it gently over her trembling shoulders. It was a gesture of impossible kindness, a quiet defiance that echoed louder than all their shouting. And then he took her hand. That simple touch cracked the air wide open. The laughter died in their throats. The jeers turned to ash in their mouths. The women who had looked away, pretending not to see, now stared in stunned disbelief. They watched as Abel Ward, the man who never spoke, the war-widowed rancher who hadn't stepped foot in town for 2 long winters, looked the biggest woman they'd ever seen in the eyes. And he said it again, not a command, but a promise. "You're coming with me." She didn't have to answer. Her silence was its own reply. She let him lead her away from the circle of monsters, her bare feet bleeding into the dust. The coat, too big and heavy, dragged behind her like a broken flag of surrender, but her back was straight as a rifle barrel. She never once looked back at the faces of her tormentors. She didn't have to. She would carry their faces in her memory forever, and nobody followed them. Not that day. They just watched, their victory suddenly feeling like a defeat, as the quiet rancher led the giant widow out of town, leaving nothing behind but their shame hanging in the blistering desert air. What they didn't know was that this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, and the storm that was coming for Dry Willow had a name. Her name was Mara. The walk to the ranch was a silent pilgrimage. The sun beat down, turning the desert trail into a skillet. Abel didn't speak, and Mara didn't either. There were no words for what had happened, no words for the strange, desperate hope that was beginning to flicker in the darkness of her soul. A rope of understanding passed between them, unspoken but strong, 2 drowning souls pulling each other toward an unknown shore. When the small wooden cabin came into view, nestled against a backdrop of unforgiving rock and skeletal trees, Mara stopped. She stared at the place, a homestead that looked as weathered and lonely as the man who owned it. It was a place that didn't know her name, didn't know the story they'd written for her in town. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like a blessing. Abel opened the cabin door and simply waited, his silhouette framed against the dark interior. She hesitated. The town square was a cage of bodies and hate, but this quiet solitude felt just as dangerous in its own way. It was a place where she would have to face herself. "You got a name?" he asked, his voice quiet, raspy from disuse. She finally looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since he'd covered her shame with his coat. His face was a roadmap of pain, his eyes the color of a stormy sky. They were eyes that had seen things, things that had broken him, but they were also eyes that saw her, not the monster, not the giant, but the woman. "Mara," she said, her own voice a stranger to her ears. "Come in, Mara." The inside of the cabin was one simple room, stark and clean but layered with a fine coat of dust, the kind that settles on a life that has been put on hold. A table, 2 chairs, a bed made with military precision. On a small shelf sat a single framed photograph, a smiling woman, a younger, happier Abel, and a small boy with his father's eyes. A ghost family, trapped in a silver frame that never got dusted. Mara's bare feet left faint red prints on the wooden floorboards, a trail of her humiliation following her even here. Abel turned away, giving her a moment of privacy she hadn't realized she desperately needed. "There's a clean dress behind that curtain," he said, his back to her. "It was my wife's. Might fit. If not, we'll figure something out." She didn't answer. He stepped out onto the porch, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her alone with the ghosts. The quiet of the ranch was a physical thing. He could hear the wind whispering secrets to the fence rails, the frantic beat of his own heart. His fingers shook as he struck a match, the flame flaring to life, and he just watched it burn down to nothing, the smoke curling into the vast, empty sky. He hadn't come to town for her. He'd come for supplies. He hadn't expected to find a public execution. But when he saw her standing there, defiant and unbroken, something inside him, something long dead, had stirred. Behind the closed door he heard the soft splash of water pouring into a basin. Then, a long silence. Then, the quiet shuffle of footsteps. When Mara stepped out onto the porch, she was wearing his wife's dress. It was a simple calico, and it strained at the seams across her broad shoulders and chest, but it covered her. Her arms were a tapestry of scratches, and her knees were bruised purple, but she was whole. Her dark hair was pulled back from her face, and her eyes, though still swollen and raw, were clear and sharp. She didn't thank him for the dress. She didn't flinch under his gaze. She walked to the small wooden table on the porch, sat down in the other chair, and looked him straight in the face. A challenge, an invitation, a demand. "They said I killed him." Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "I know," Abel replied, his own voice just as steady. "Did you believe them?" "No." The word hung in the air between them. Mara watched him, her eyes searching his face, looking for the lie, for the pity, for the trick. She found none. "Why not?" Abel leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. "Because I've seen killers," he said, his gaze distant, lost in a memory she couldn't see. "And you're not one." It was a simple declaration, but it landed like a physical blow. It was the first time anyone had looked at her and not seen a monster. He got up, went inside, and came back with 2 tin cups of steaming black coffee. He set one in front of her and sat back down, the table between them feeling like a truce line. "Tell me what happened," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a key, unlocking the cage of her silence. Mara's throat worked, but she forced the words out, her voice raspy and dry. "He was drunk again. Silas. He always got mean when he was drunk. Said I was hiding money from him." Her gaze fell to the rising steam. "I wasn't. There was never any money to hide. He threw the skillet. It missed my head, shattered against the wall. Then he hit me. Twice." She paused, her knuckles white where she gripped the warm cup. "He said I'd better cry like a real woman or he'd make me cry." A bitter, broken sound escaped her lips. "I didn't cry." Abel just nodded once, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer sympathy. He offered something better, his attention. "I pushed him back. she continued, her voice gaining strength. Just to get him off me. I didn't even hit him, I just held him. But he was clumsy, drunk. He stumbled backward, over the woodpile we kept by the cabin door. He fell wrong. She finally looked up, her eyes locking with his. His head hit the corner of the chopping block. That's what killed him. The fall. She blinked, the first sign of the tremor that was shaking her from the inside out. Her voice cracked, finally betraying the terror she'd held at bay. Do you believe me? I already said I did, Abel said, his voice gentle but firm. Mara shook her head, a gesture of pure despair. That doesn't mean anything in a place like Dry Willow. Abel leaned forward, his forearms resting on the rough-hewn table. You're right. It doesn't. Not to them. He met her gaze, and for a second she saw the ghost of his own pain flicker in his eyes. But it means something here, in this house, on this land. She bit her lip, drawing blood. They'll come for me again. The sheriff, the men. They will, he agreed, his voice grim. They'll say I'm dangerous. They'll try to lock me up, or worse. They might try. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of the wind. Finally, she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since he'd first stepped into that circle of hate. Why? Why are you helping me? Abel stared down into his coffee cup as if the answers were written in the black liquid. When he looked up, his face was stripped bare, all his defenses gone. Because when my wife Sarah was dying, no one would help, he said, the words torn from him. The fever came on fast. I rode to town for the doctor, but he was at the mayor's house playing cards. He said he'd come in the morning. The preacher said it was God's will. The women. They whispered that Sarah was too proud, that our boy was sickly because we didn't pray hard enough. They all stood by and did nothing. His voice dropped to a whisper. I buried her and my son under that mesquite tree out back, and I learned that day that the worst kind of monster isn't the one people invent. It's the one they become when they stand by and watch. He looked at Mara, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. I won't be that monster again. I'll never forget what their silence cost me. That was the first time Mara's composure cracked. A single tear, hot and sharp, escaped and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She didn't sob. She didn't break down. Her jaw clenched so tight it ached, but she just nodded once. And in that moment, the silence between them changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of survivors. It was something new, something alive. That night, Abel gave her the bed. He didn't ask. He didn't offer. He just pointed to it and then unrolled a wool blanket for himself on the floor near the cold hearth. It was a gesture of respect, a recognition of the hell she had endured. Mara didn't say thank you. She couldn't. The words were a logjam in her throat, caught behind a dam of unshed tears. She lay on her side, fully clothed in his dead wife's dress, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling planks. The cotton wrinkled against her skin, a constant reminder that she was a stranger here, wearing a ghost's clothes, sleeping in a ghost's bed. Every muscle in her body ached from the manhandling, from the shoves and the grabs, from the deep, ugly bruises that were still forming. But it was her mind that wouldn't rest. It kept circling back to the same impossible thought, the same burning question. Why him? Why did Abel Ward, the town pariah, the broken recluse, see her when no one else did? She didn't know the whole story yet. She didn't know that the town hadn't just stood by while his family died. They had blamed him. They whispered that he was too proud to beg the doctor, too stubborn to accept the church's charity. They said he'd let his own son die out of spite. The same people who had stripped her bare had already stripped him of his dignity, his reputation, his hope. They had left him with nothing but his grief and his silence. and Abel, in turn, knew nothing of her past. He didn't know that Mara had once been a midwife, her large, strong hands bringing life into the world, not taking it. She had delivered 14 babies across 4 counties, her skill a quiet legend, before her husband Silas, in a jealous, drunken rage, had forbidden her from practicing. He didn't know that the reason she was stronger than most men was because she'd had to be. She'd once carried a farmer's boy, delirious with fever, 5 miles on her back to the nearest clinic, while the boy's own father lay passed out drunk in a ditch. They didn't know the specifics of each other's pain, but they recognized the shape of it. They knew the crushing weight of being judged, of being misunderstood, of being cast out. They were both fluent in the language of silence, and for tonight, in the suffocating darkness of the small cabin, that was enough. As the moon climbed high, casting long shadows across the floor, Mara whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible. "They're not done with me." From his place by the hearth, Abel's voice came back, low and certain, a rumble in the quiet. "No, they'll come back, with ropes next time." He let out a long, slow breath, the sound of a man who had made his peace with violence. Let them try. The fire in the hearth had died down to glowing embers, but neither of them slept. The threat of what was to come hung in the air, thick and heavy as smoke. Just before dawn, when the sky was a bruised purple, Mara was already outside. She'd found an old rake in the dilapidated barn and was methodically clearing the dead leaves and debris from around the porch. Her movements were slow, stiff with pain. Her ankles, cut and raw from the barefoot walk, were wrapped in crude bandages she'd made from a torn piece of fabric. But she didn't stop. She needed the work, the simple, repetitive motion to keep the demons at bay. Abel watched her from the cabin window, hidden in the shadows. He saw the way she flinched when she bent over, the way she had to steady herself against the porch rail before lifting a fallen bucket. She wasn't healed. She was just refusing to be broken. It was a language he understood better than words. He saw the pride in her posture, the defiant set of her jaw. She was not asking for pity. She was claiming her space. Later, as she boiled creek water for coffee over a small fire, she finally spoke, her voice still rough. "What do you grow here?" "Barley," Abel said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "And bones." Mara blinked, pausing with the spoon in her hand. Bones. He didn't smile. There was no humor in his eyes. "A lot of things die out here. Animals, crops, hope. This land holds a grudge." She didn't flinch. Instead, a strange, hard light came into her eyes. "Then it should love me," she said quietly. "I've buried plenty myself." He finally turned his head and looked her full in the face. The unspoken question hung between them. What now? What happens when the sun is fully up and the world remembers you exist? "You want to stay?" he asked, his voice direct. Mara stirred the bubbling water, her reflection distorted in the pot. "I don't have anywhere else to go." "That's not what I asked," he said, his tone sharpening slightly. He was pushing her, forcing her to choose, to claim her own fate. She couldn't be a victim here. His ranch wasn't a charity. It was a sanctuary, and sanctuaries had to be defended. She stopped stirring. Her large hands tightened around the wooden spoon until her knuckles were white. She looked up from the fire, her eyes meeting his across the small clearing. "I want to stay." He gave a single sharp nod. "Then you'll work, and you'll eat, and you'll be safe." It was a simple contract, an oath. Mara's voice dropped, the fear creeping back in. "What about them, the town?" "They're cowards," Abel said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "And cowards always bark loudest the day after they fail." But he was wrong. The cowards weren't done barking. That afternoon, as Mara was down at the creek, scrubbing her borrowed dress on a smooth, flat rock, she heard the sound of hoofbeats. 4 riders, coming up the trail to the ranch, their silhouettes dark against the bright afternoon sun. Her heart hammered against her ribs. They'd found her. She scrambled up the bank, her dress dripping, her mind racing. But before she could even make it back to the cabin, Abel was already there. He stepped out onto the porch, a shotgun resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. He didn't raise it. He didn't have to. He walked to the fence line that marked the edge of his property and just stood there, a silent, unmovable object. The 4 men reined in their horses just outside the fence. They were men from town, their faces familiar and twisted with self-righteous anger. One of them, a big, bearded man named Jedediah, Silas's older brother, spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dust. "She in there, Ward?" Jedediah called out, his voice dripping with menace. "She's where she belongs," Abel replied, his voice calm, steady, and dangerously quiet. Jedediah shifted in his saddle. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Abel. The sheriff sent us. Says she's a danger. Needs to be brought in for questioning." Abel's eyes were as still and cold as creek stones in winter. "You already made it hard. Last I checked, questioning doesn't involve tearing a woman's clothes off in the street. Now ride on." The men exchanged uneasy glances. They hadn't expected this. They had expected the broken recluse, not this granite statue of a man with a shotgun and nothing left to lose. Another man, smaller and weaselly, leaned forward. "You siding with a killer? You know what she is." Abel didn't even blink. He took a slow step forward, his knuckles white on the shotgun stock. "I know she's a woman who survived you," he said, his voice dropping so low it was almost a growl. And then, he added, the words like thunder rolling in from a distant storm, "And I know she's where she belongs." The silence stretched, taut and thick with the threat of violence. Jedediah's face was a mask of fury. He wanted to push, to force the issue, but something in Abel's eyes stopped him. It was a look he'd seen before, in the eyes of cornered wolves and dying soldiers. It was the look of a man who would burn the whole world down to protect what was his. Finally, with a curse, Jedediah yanked on his horse's reins, turning the animal so sharply it whinnied in protest. The other men followed suit, their bravado evaporating in the face of Abel's cold resolve. They rode away without another word, and Abel didn't lower the shotgun until their dust was a faint smudge on the horizon. When he finally turned around, Mara was standing on the porch. She hadn't run. She hadn't hidden. She had stood there and watched the whole thing. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides, and for the first time in days, she wasn't shaking. She was crying. Great silent tears streamed down her face, but they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of shock, of disbelief, of a strange and painful gratitude. For her entire life, men had either stared at her, laughed at her, or hurt her. But Abel Ward had stood in front of her, and in doing so, he had given her back something she thought she had lost forever in the dust of the town square, a reason to fight. But the fight was far from over. As Jedediah rode away, he had looked back, and his eyes held a promise. He wasn't just angry about his brother. He wanted something else, something on this land, and he would be back to take it. The days that followed settled into a strange, fragile rhythm. An unspoken truce existed between the ranch and the town. No one from Dry Willow came up the dusty trail, and Abel and Mara didn't go down. The ranch became their entire world, a small island of solitude in a sea of hate. They worked from sunup to sundown, the hard physical labor a balm for their troubled minds. Abel mended fences and tended to his small herd of cattle, while Mara, with her surprising strength and innate gentleness, took over the care of the horses and the small, neglected vegetable garden behind the cabin. They rarely spoke, but their silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the comfortable sounds of shared work, the rhythmic thump of an axe splitting wood, the soft whinny of a horse being brushed, the scrape of a hoe against the dry earth. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun bleed across the sky, painting the desolate landscape in hues of orange and purple. One evening, as Abel was cleaning his rifle, his movements slow and methodical, Mara spoke into the twilight. He wanted the land. Abel didn't look up from his work. Who did? Silas, my husband. Mara stared out at the sprawling, dusty acres that surrounded them. He always said this plot, the one my pa left me, was worthless, but he never wanted to sell. He was obsessed with it. He'd spend hours walking the fence line, digging small holes, always searching for something. Abel stopped cleaning the rifle. He placed it carefully on the table beside him. Searching for what? I never knew, Mara admitted. He'd get drunk and talk about a secret, about how our fortune was right under our feet. I thought it was just the liquor talking. But now, Jedediah, the way he looked at this place, it wasn't just about me. A new piece of the puzzle clicked into place. This wasn't just about a grieving brother or a town's prejudice. It was about greed. Your pa, Abel said, his voice thoughtful. What was his name? Elias Thorne. He was a prospector years ago. He always said this land was special, that it held more than just rock and dust. But he never found anything. Died poor. The name Thorne didn't mean anything to Abel, but the story sparked a flicker of something in his memory. A piece of old town gossip he'd overheard years ago, something about a lost claim and a hidden map. But that was just a children's story, wasn't it? A local legend to explain away a mad old prospector's obsession. That night, a storm rolled in, the kind that rips across the desert with sudden, violent fury. Thunder cracked like a whip, and lightning illuminated the stark landscape in brief, terrifying flashes. Mara found she couldn't sleep. The storm outside was a mirror of the one inside her. She kept seeing Jedediah's face, his eyes filled with a covetous gleam. Driven by an instinct she couldn't explain, she lit a lantern and made her way out to the small, dilapidated shed where Silas had kept his tools and his whiskey. The place was a mess, filled with rusted equipment and broken junk. But Mara wasn't looking for tools. She was looking for a secret. She ran her hands along the rough wooden walls, tapped on the dirt floor, searched for any sign of a loose board or a hidden compartment. Nothing. She was about to give up, to dismiss it as a foolish whim, when her lantern light caught on something glinting in a dark corner, half buried under a pile of old burlap sacks. She knelt down, her heart pounding in time with the thunder overhead. It was a small, locked metal box, Silas's strong box. He always kept it with him, and she had assumed the sheriff had taken it when they'd taken his body. But here it was. It was locked tight. She looked around frantically for something to pry it open with. Her eyes landed on a heavy crowbar. With a grunt of effort, she wedged the tip into the seam and threw her entire weight against it. The metal shrieked in protest, and then, with a loud crack, the lock broke. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed newspaper, was not gold or money. It was an old leather-bound journal and a rolled-up piece of oilskin tied with a leather thong. She unrolled the oilskin first. It was a hand-drawn map. A map of her own land, the land she was standing on. But it was covered in strange markings, lines, and a series of numbers that made no sense. At the bottom, in faded ink, was the signature of her father, Elias Thorne. Then she opened the journal. It was Silas's. The entries were mostly drunken ramblings, filled with self-pity and rage. But as she flipped through the pages, her blood ran cold. He wasn't just looking for gold. He had found something. The last entry, dated the day before he died, was scrawled in a shaky, barely legible hand. Found it. The old man wasn't crazy after all. Just south of the dried creek bed under the flat rock that looks like a skull. The entrance is hidden. It's all there. The Thorne legacy. Jedediah was right. He said Ward's silence could be bought, that the whole town would look the other way for a share. But it's mine. All mine. A flash of lightning lit up the shed, and in that instant, Mara understood everything. The town's sudden hatred wasn't just about her size. Silas hadn't just stumbled upon some old gold claim. He had told his brother, and likely others. They had all been in on it. They wanted her gone, discredited, locked away, or driven off, so they could claim whatever her father had hidden on this land. Her husband's death hadn't been a tragedy to them. It had been an opportunity. And then she saw the last line of the entry, a line that made the air freeze in her lungs. Have to get rid of the woman. She knows too much. She sees too much. Abel Ward's wife saw too much too. Look what happened to her. The thunder cracked directly overhead, and Mara let out a choked cry. Abel's wife. Sarah. It wasn't a fever. It wasn't the doctor's neglect. They had silenced her. Because she had discovered their secret. The entire town, the sheriff, the preacher, Jedediah, they were all complicit. They were not just bullies and cowards. They were murderers. And now they were coming for her. She wasn't just fighting for her freedom anymore. She was fighting for her life. And for the first time, she truly understood the quiet, dangerous man who had taken her in. Abel wasn't just hiding from his grief. He was waiting for a reason to unleash the hell he had been holding back for 2 long years. And she had just brought it to his doorstep. Mara stumbled out of the shed, the journal clutched in her hand, the rain plastering her hair to her face. She ran, heedless of the mud and the dark, her mind a whirlwind of terror and rage. She burst into the cabin, soaking wet and gasping for breath. Abel was on his feet in an instant, the shotgun in his hands, his eyes wild and alert. "What is it? What happened?" She couldn't speak. She just thrust the journal into his hands, her fingers leaving muddy streaks on the worn leather. He took it, his eyes scanning her face, seeing the raw terror there. He lit another lamp, the cabin filling with a warm, steady glow that pushed back against the storm. He sat at the table and began to read. Mara watched his face as he turned the pages. She saw his expression harden, the muscles in his jaw clenching and unclenching. She saw the quiet grief in his eyes turn into a cold, hard fury. When he got to the final entry, the part about his wife, he stopped. He read the words over and over, as if trying to force them to mean something else. But the truth was there, ugly and undeniable, scrawled in a dead man's hand. He closed the journal softly. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. For a long moment, he just stared at the wall, his gaze fixed on the faded photograph of his smiling wife and son. The silence in the cabin was no longer a comfort. It was the calm at the center of a hurricane. When he finally looked at Mara, his eyes were different. The storm that had been raging outside was now inside him. All the pain, all the grief, all the quiet suffering of the past 2 years had been forged into a single sharp point of purpose. "The dried creek bed," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "South of here. I know the place." "What are we going to do?" Mara whispered, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. Abel stood up. He walked to the hearth and picked up the rifle he'd been cleaning earlier. He checked the action, his movements precise and economical. "Silas made a mistake," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "He wrote it down. That journal is our proof." "Proof won't matter to them," Mara said, her voice shaking. "Jedediah, the sheriff, they'll just bury it. They'll bury us." "Not if everyone knows," Abel said. He turned to face her, and she saw a man she hadn't seen before. The broken rancher was gone. In his place stood a soldier. "They use the town's fear to condemn you. We're going to use the town's conscience to condemn them." He had a plan, a crazy, dangerous plan. "The preacher holds a town meeting every month. The next one is tomorrow night. The whole town will be there. In the church." Mara stared at him, horrified. "Go back there? They'll lynch us before we even get to the church doors." "They won't be expecting it," Abel said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. They think we're hiding. They think we're afraid. We're going to walk right into the lion's den, and we're going to read this journal aloud, in front of everyone, in God's house. It was suicide. A lamb's walking to the slaughter. But as she looked at Abel's face, she saw that he was right. Hiding wouldn't save them. Running wouldn't save them. The only way out was through. They had to expose the rot at the heart of Dry Willow, or be consumed by it. "All right," Mara said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. She walked over to the map which she had laid out on the table. "But first," she said, her finger tracing the lines her father had drawn so long ago, "I want to know what they're willing to kill for." The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the air washed clean and the earth smelling of rain and sage. They didn't wait. With the first light, Abel and Mara rode out, not towards town, but south, towards the dried creek bed that cut through the edge of Abel's property and into Mara's. Abel carried his rifle, and Mara had the journal and map tucked safely inside her shirt. They found the place easily. A wide, flat rock, bleached white by the sun, shaped uncannily like a human skull. It sat at the base of a small, rocky bluff. It took both their strengths to move it, the rock groaning as it scraped against the damp earth. Underneath was a dark, narrow opening, just big enough for a person to squeeze through. It wasn't a mine shaft. It was a natural cave entrance. Abel lit a lantern. "You stay here," he said. "Keep watch." "No," Mara said, her jaw set. "This is my land, my father's legacy. I'm going with you." He saw the determination in her eyes and didn't argue. He handed her a pistol he'd brought. "Stay behind me, and if anything moves that isn't me, shoot it." The air inside the cave was cool and damp, and smelled of ancient stone. The passageway was narrow, forcing them to duck their heads. After about 20 feet, it opened up into a large, cavernous chamber. Abel held the lantern high, and its light danced across the walls. Mara gasped. The walls of the cave weren't just rock. They were embedded with thick, glittering veins of raw, unprocessed silver. It wasn't gold. It was something far more valuable in this part of the country, a fortune. Enough to build a city, to buy armies, to make kings out of paupers like Silas and Jedediah. In the center of the chamber were the remnants of an old camp, a rusted pickaxe, a bedroll that had long since rotted away, and a small wooden chest. Mara knelt and opened it. Inside were her father's prospecting journals, detailing his discovery and his reasons for keeping it secret. He feared a silver rush would destroy the land he loved. He had planned to reveal it slowly, responsibly, but he had died before he could. "He wasn't crazy," Mara whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "He was protecting it. And now we have to," Abel said, his voice grim. "This is what they killed my wife for. This is what they tried to take from you." He looked around the cavern at the immense, glittering wealth. "And this is what's going to tear that town apart." They didn't stay long. They took Elias Thorne's journals as further proof and sealed the cave entrance again, carefully brushing away their tracks. The ride back to the ranch was silent, the weight of their discovery settling heavily upon them. They now had the motive, the proof, and a target. But they were still just two people against an entire town built on a foundation of lies and murder. As they approached the ranch, Abel reined in his horse, his body suddenly tense. "Something's wrong," he said. Mara followed his gaze. A thin tendril of black smoke was rising from the direction of the cabin. A sick feeling of dread washed over her. They spurred their horses, racing up the final stretch of the trail. The barn was on fire. Flames licked up the dry wooden sides, thick, oily smoke billowing into the clear blue sky. "It's a warning," Mara said, her voice choked with smoke and fear. "They know we're onto them." Abel leaped from his horse, pulling buckets from the well, but it was no use. The old dry timber was catching too fast. The barn was lost. He stood there, his face streaked with soot, his knuckles white as he gripped the bucket handle. They had tried to burn him out, to scare him off. They had underestimated him. They had underestimated them both. He turned to Mara, his eyes burning with an intensity that matched the flames. "Get ready," he said, his voice like flint striking steel. "Tonight, we're not just going to the meeting, we're going to war." They didn't go in peace. They went prepared. Abel spent the rest of the afternoon reinforcing the cabin doors and windows, while Mara packed saddlebags with food, water, and ammunition. They both knew that after tonight, they might not be able to come back here. Win or lose, their lives on this quiet ranch were over. As dusk fell, casting long, menacing shadows across the land, they rode out. They didn't take the main trail. Abel led them on a winding, hidden path through the rocky hills, a path he knew from his days of hunting. The full moon rose, bathing the landscape in an eerie silver light. They tethered their horses in a thicket of mesquite trees on the outskirts of Dry Willow and made their way into town on foot, sticking to the shadows of the alleyways. The town was quiet, but it was the tense, watchful quiet of a predator waiting to spring a trap. Lights glowed in the windows of the church, and they could hear the low murmur of voices from inside. The entire town was there, just as Abel had predicted. They circled around to the back of the church. A small vestry window was cracked open to let in the cool night air. Abel peered through. He could see them all. Sheriff Miller, looking nervous and sweaty. Jedediah, his face a mask of smug arrogance, sitting in the front pew like a king. The preacher, droning on about sin and redemption, his eyes darting towards the door every few seconds. They were all waiting, but they were waiting for Abel and Mara to come through the front door. "They've got men posted outside," Abel whispered, pulling back from the window. "2 on the porch, at least 1 more by the side." "So we can't get in," Mara said, her heart sinking. "Not through the doors," Abel corrected. A grim smile played on his lips. He pointed up towards the church's bell tower. "But they won't be watching the roof." It was a perilous climb. The old wooden siding of the church was brittle, and the footholds were treacherous. But Abel moved with the quiet confidence of a man who was no stranger to scaling walls in the dark. He went first, securing a rope, and then helped Mara, his strong hands guiding her, her own strength keeping her steady. They made it to the small balcony of the bell tower, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Below them, the town of Dry Willow was laid out like a map. They could see the ambush, the armed men lurking in the shadows waiting for them. From here they could also hear the preacher's voice clearly through the open slats of the tower. He was talking about her, about the unfortunate incident with the unstable woman. He was praising the town's swift action in protecting themselves from a dangerous influence. He was painting her as a monster, a killer, a blight on their righteous community. And the congregation murmured their agreement. Mara's hands clenched into fists. Rage, cold and pure, burned through her. She looked at Abel. He was holding the rope for the church bell. A wild, desperate idea sparked in his eyes. "They want a show," he whispered, his voice tight with anticipation. "Let's give them one." He handed her Silas's journal. "When I ring that bell, you start reading. As loud as you can. Don't stop, no matter what." Before she could ask what he was going to do, he took a deep breath and pulled on the rope. The great bronze bell above them exploded with sound, a deep, resonant bong that shattered the night's quiet. Once, twice, 3 times. It wasn't the gentle peal for Sunday service. It was a frantic, clanging alarm, a fire bell, a call to arms. Down below, the town meeting erupted into chaos. People started shouting, spilling out of the church doors to see what was happening. Jedediah and the sheriff rushed out onto the porch, their faces contorted with confusion and rage as they scanned the empty street. And then, from the darkness above them, Mara's voice rang out, amplified by the night air, clear and strong as the bell itself. "My name is Mara Calloway, and you are all liars." Silence fell over the crowd as they looked up, their faces a sea of pale, upturned moons. They saw her, a giant silhouette against the night sky, standing in the bell tower like an avenging angel. "You called me a killer to hide your own sins!" she boomed, her voice filled with all the pain and fury she had held back. "But my husband, Silas, he kept a record of your wickedness." She opened the journal, her hands steady now, and began to read. She read Silas's words about the silver, about his deal with Jedediah and the sheriff to drive her off her land. She read his confession that the town had stood by and let Sarah Ward die because she had discovered their secret. Every word was a hammer blow, shattering the fragile peace of Dry Willow. Down below, Jedediah let out a roar of rage and raised his pistol towards the bell tower. "She's lying! Shut her up!" But before he could fire, another voice, cold and deadly, cut through the night from a different direction. "Drop it, Jedediah." Everyone turned. Abel was standing on the roof of the general store across the street, his rifle leveled, the moonlight glinting off the long barrel. He wasn't aiming at Jedediah. He was aiming at Sheriff Miller. "You were sworn to uphold the law, Miller," Abel called out, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. "But you traded your badge for a promise of silver. You let my wife die. You stood by while these men tried to condemn an innocent woman. Your lies end tonight." The sheriff, caught in the rifle's sight, began to tremble, his face ashen. The townsfolk, trapped between Mara's damning words from above and Abel's cold justice from across the street, began to back away from Jedediah and the sheriff. The seeds of doubt had been planted. They looked at each other, their certainty wavering, the ugliness of their own actions reflected in their neighbors' eyes. "It's all lies!" Jedediah screamed, his face purple with rage. He swung his pistol towards Abel. "You'll hang for this, Ward!" A shot rang out, but it wasn't from Abel's rifle. It came from the crowd. One of the farmers, a man whose son Mara had once saved from a snakebite, was holding a smoking hunting rifle. Jedediah staggered, clutching his shoulder, his pistol clattering to the dusty street. The spell was broken. The town's fear of Jedediah and the sheriff was finally eclipsed by their shame. Another man stepped forward, then another. The crowd, which had once been a mob united in hate against Mara, was now a mob united against the men who had deceived them. Sheriff Miller, seeing his power evaporate, threw down his gun and raised his hands in surrender. Jedediah, clutching his bleeding shoulder, tried to run, but he was quickly surrounded by the furious townspeople he had once controlled. From the bell tower, Mara watched as the lies that had poisoned Dry Willow were finally brought into the light. She had come to this town a victim, stripped bare and branded a monster. But tonight, standing under the moon, with her voice echoing across the rooftops, she was their reckoning. The quiet rancher and the giant widow had not just saved themselves. They had given the town a chance to save its own soul. The justice they had been denied was now being delivered, not by a badge or a bullet, but by the undeniable power of the truth. The long night was over, and a new day was dawning for Dry Willow. In the aftermath, the town turned on itself. The truth, once unleashed, was a wildfire. Jedediah, the sheriff, and 3 other men were locked in the town jail, their cells guarded by the very farmers they had once intimidated. Elias Thorne's journals, along with Silas's, were passed from hand to hand, the evidence of the conspiracy undeniable. The silver mine became town property, its future to be decided by a council, its profits pledged to build a new school and a proper doctor's office. Abel and Mara slipped away before the sun came up, riding back to the ranch, leaving the town to reckon with its demons. They stood before the smoldering ruins of the barn, the rising sun casting a golden glow on the scene of destruction. It was all over, but nothing was the same. "What now?" Mara asked, her voice quiet in the morning stillness. Abel looked at her, his face weary but his eyes clear for the first time in years. The ghosts that had haunted him were finally at peace. "Now," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "we rebuild." They worked side by side, clearing the debris, planning the new barn. The silence between them was different now. It was not the silence of shared pain, but the silence of shared peace. They had faced the darkness together and emerged into the light. They were no longer just survivors. They were partners. A few days later, a wagon came up the trail. It was the farmer who had fired the first shot, his wife beside him. They brought lumber, nails, and food. They didn't say much. The farmer just looked at Abel, nodded, and said, "We're here to help." Soon, more wagons arrived. The people of Dry Willow, their faces etched with shame and a newfound respect, came to help rebuild the barn they had allowed to be burned. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They offered it in the form of hard work and quiet solidarity. Mara stood on the porch of the small cabin, watching them. Men who had once jeered at her were now sweating to raise a beam for her new home. Women who had whispered behind her back now offered her fresh-baked bread and shy smiles. She was no longer Mara the monster, the giant widow. She was just Mara. And for the first time in her life, that felt like enough. Abel came and stood beside her, handing her a cup of coffee. He followed her gaze to the bustling activity, to the rising frame of the new barn. "Looks like you belong here after all," he said softly. Mara looked up at him, at this quiet, broken man who had seen the truth in her when no one else would. She saw the lines of pain around his eyes had softened. She saw the hint of a future there, one that wasn't defined by loss. "We belong here," she corrected him gently. He looked at her, and in that shared glance, 1,000 unspoken words were exchanged. They were two outcasts who had found a home not in a place, but in each other. Their story was not one of romance, but of something deeper, stronger. It was a story of redemption, of courage, and of the quiet, unshakable power of two souls who refused to be broken. They had faced down a town of monsters and, in doing so, had found their own humanity. The ranch was no longer a place of sorrow and solitude. It was a sanctuary, a symbol of hope, a testament to the fact that even in the dustiest, most forgotten corners of the world, new things could grow. If you enjoyed this story, and you believe in the power of truth and the courage of the human heart, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We share stories like this every week, stories that remind us that even in the darkest of times, there is always a flicker of light. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a journey into the heart of what it means to be human. And before you go, drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. It's incredible to see how far these stories of hope can travel. Thank you for being a part of this community,